He's a medical doctor with a background in physics, and he's been fascinated by the Shroud since the early 1980s when he saw David Rolfe's documentary, The Silent Witness, that I mentioned, that's freely accessible for 2 weeks. He attended the conference in Frascati, Italy in 2010 and presented a paper there. He also attended a conference in Poland, presented 2 papers there. That was in 2011. In 2012, he attended the Valencia conference and presented there. His website is lightoftheshroud.com. Check out his website. It's lightoftheshroud.com. Dr. Andrew Silverman.
Thank you very much. So, the title of my image, natural, manufactured, or miracle? Or is there a fourth possibility? Now, we've seen from what other people have already presented that the Shroud image is something that nobody knows how to replicate, even using 21st century technology. The attempts all fall short in one way or another. When you start to look at them under the microscope, they don't have the same characteristics, the surface characteristics, and the distance-coded information. They never have all of these features present. There's always some missing. And the question is, if it wasn't manufactured, then could it have been some natural process that happened just by coincidence of a sequence of events, that perhaps a body was producing gases, or that there was an earthquake that made electrical changes? Well, what's interesting is that the Shroud image is, as far as we know, it's unique. There's nothing like it in human history that is known about that has these same characteristics. And there's people, of course, who consider that the formation of the image was a miracle and can never be understood. It's always going to remain a mystery. But to me, in a sense, that's sort of a little bit of a cop-out, because I think the Shroud image is a physical phenomenon that we can study empirically and scientifically. And it has been studied, and I think, if we're trying to understand the image, we should at least try to bear in mind all the evidence that has been carefully gathered from Secondo Pia through to Stirp and onwards. Now, the interesting thing that we know, looking at it from a medical perspective, as a medical doctor, from looking at the forensic pathologist's reports on it, is that there are 2 separate events. One is the blood stains, which are a very simple process, that is just a contact process from, as people have said before, from the exudation from clotted blood on the surface of the body. And then there was an image formation which happened after the blood stains. And we know that the blood stains happened after the death of the man on the Shroud, and we know that for a very simple reason. And if any of you have ever been in an ER room and seen someone with severe lacerations to their scalp, you'll see that they get completely covered in blood. It bleeds so heavily. And yet on the Shroud, we see only a very relatively small amount of blood. And of course, as many of you know, Dr. Lavoie did some experiments using blood and contact with linen, and found that the only time that you can actually form the blood clot is within about 90 minutes of the blood having come out of the body. Of course, if the blood was still coming out of the body when the cloth wrapped it, which it would have been if he was still alive, then the whole thing would have been soaked in blood. Now, a lot of the research that has been done, is particularly in the work of Dr. De Lazzaro and his colleagues, lend support to the notion that the image could have been formed by a short, intense burst of radiant energy that came from this dead body of the man. Now, and he's done his research using, of course, as you know, ultraviolet lasers with very short, intense bursts of radiant energy from them. Now, this is quite interesting to try to look at what this might signify and what it might mean, how we can understand it. Is there a way that we can understand evidence from physics that has been around ever since the advent of quantum theory at the turn of the 20th century that may give us a clue to understanding how such a phenomenon could occur? Now, the light is interesting from the point of view of, there's been some groundbreaking research that has just been published, I think this month, in a journal called Resuscitation, a peer-reviewed journal, a team including a Southampton-based anaesthetist from the UK, and they've done a multi-centre study on people's experience, people's remembered experiences that they recount following a resuscitation after a cardiac arrest. And what they found is that a significant proportion of those people had experiences that you may be familiar with, including a bright light and so on, and also some of them were found to have what's called veridical experiences, which means that they were able to recall things that they saw or heard, that while their brain waves were flat, if you like, that their mind was still perceiving information and was retaining that information so that they were able to recall it after the resuscitation had happened. And the editors of the journal commented that, you know, this is very important to make us understand what actually the process of death entails. Well, what it's suggesting, of course, and I've had long chats with Peter Fennick, who is a neuropsychiatrist, who's one of the people involved in the study. What it suggests is that our brain doesn't make our mind. Okay? Because when the brain waves are flat, the mind is still continuing. It means that death is not the end. And perhaps the corollary of that might be that conception or birth isn't the beginning. If our brains don't make us, then why do we think that we are just a sort of chance collection of cells and atoms that form into a particular shape? Now, it's interesting that one of the common features of these near-death experiences is this bright light that people see. And the descriptions of that light is, people often say, and in that light was contained all knowledge and love, compassion. They felt loved by this light and welcomed by it. And it was as though when they experienced that light, they experience everything that they have done to others in their life reviews. They feel anything that they've done that's been kind to another person, they feel it being done to them. Anything that they did that harmed another individual, they feel what that was like. And it all happens in an instant, and that light lends them an assurance that they're not about to just be extinguished, which some might say is just a nice thing to comfort themselves. But the veridical experiences, the fact that they in this study that was done, in this multi-center study, where they actually placed auditory and visual cues that would be able to be heard or seen by someone who was conscious during this process, and people were able to actually recount what these things were, even though their brain waves were flat. What during a cardiac arrest, the brain isn't able to function. Even though if you're doing CPR, it still doesn't enable the brain to function during a cardiac arrest, and this has been verified many times. Now, could there be a clue in this, that there's this light in the near-death experience, and the light that may potentially have formed the image on the shroud? Now, what do we know about light from modern physics? Well, I mean, from relativity, for example, we know that at the speed of light, that space and time are no longer, not just that they're no longer separate from each other, they no longer entail separation. The photon gets from A to B, from a photon's eye view, if you like, instantaneously. There's no time in between them and there's no space in between them. That light unifies all points in instantness, if you like. It's called the null cone on the relativity Minkowskian diagrams. Null because it's zero. There's zero space, zero separation in space, zero separation in time. And is that perhaps a clue that there's something about light which is about union as opposed to separation, whereas the physical universe, space, time and matter, is really the arena of separation. You can't have separation without space, and you can't have space without separation. And we all exist as individuals in separation, as awareness and free will that are bounded by our own particular patterns of restriction and limit that demarcate us each out as individuals. Now, people often assume that the physics description of matter and mind is a materialistic one, and they assume that physicists must think that the brain makes the mind. Well, I mean, a lot of neurobiologists do think that the brain makes the mind, and a lot of them haven't actually really studied quantum physics very much. If you go back to the originators of quantum physics, people like Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger, they were interviewed in the 1930s by a newspaper in the UK called The Observer. And Max Planck was asked, do you think that consciousness can be explained in terms of matter and its laws? And he replied, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. And Erwin Schrödinger said, consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. I don't know if you're familiar with the Leibniz-Mill analogy that he was referring to the brain in those terms in his day, where they'd gone with industrialization as like a mill, and you could wander around the mill, but you never actually, however many nerve cells you look at, you never find awareness. And of course, quantum theory suggests that it's through observation that matter takes on properties, and it's been shown through the EPR experiment that matter does not have actual properties until they're measured, and it doesn't have something called separability either. So consciousness cannot be accounted for in terms of matter, but matter relies on consciousness for it to exist. Now there's a physicist at Stanford called Andre Linder, okay, and he is one of the leading people in something called inflationary theory, and he, in his textbook on inflationary theory, which pertains to the Big Bang and the origin of the universe, he looked at the whole universe from a quantum point of view, and he pointed out the details are in the reference that I've given on in my abstract. And he pointed out that actually, without an observer, without consciousness, you have a dead universe. That actually the mass and energy of the universe cancel out to zero unless you have an observer there who can be within the universe to observe it, to make it real, to make time. And Erwin Schrödinger pointed out that the mind is always now. We only ever experience the now. What we call the past is how that has influenced the present and our memories of the past. And what we call the future is potential possibilities. And they're possibilities rather than actualities, I would argue, because we have freedom of choice. That's how we can actually have something that's a possibility that's not actually defined yet. And if you read the book by two physics professors, Rosenblum and Kottner, called The Quantum Enigma, you'll see that they postulate that actually in quantum theory you're seeing the demonstration of freedom of choice based upon how you can choose to observe something, making it real, and even something called the delayed choice effect, how you can measure something and influence its past. That past and present and future are only relevant within consciousness. So coming back to the Turin Shroud and this burst of light. Now there's another physicist called David Bohm who made the point in an interview that was done and has been published, that matter is basically frozen light. Now remember, light is that which unites separate points in space and time, that if there is light between them, from the point of view of that light, there is no separation in space or time. And matter is frozen light. Matter is what happens when light takes on location, and therefore separation occurs. Now, what if the fact that of our physical existence, our existence as separate individuals, is a result of our having become restricted and limited through freedom of choice, that we have become less than our full potential? And if for example, Schrödinger was right when he said mind is always now, then time itself is actually a product of mind, and that which mind has created does not have the power to bring mind to the fore or destroy it. This was written in his book, What is Life? And therefore, he postulated that mind had to be eternal, without beginning or end, because time itself depends on mind for its existence, just as matter depends on mind for its existence. Now, if we have no beginning or end, and yet the universe had a beginning at the Big Bang, then we didn't begin at the Big Bang. Our existence is eternal, and if there's no separation before the Big Bang, then we're all one there. Is this perhaps what Jesus of Nazareth, all the evidence is pointing to the conclusion that it may well have been him, that he was the one who was it was his burial cloth. When he said, love thy neighbour as thyself, that he was pointing to the fact that at the fundamental level we're all one, and yet we've become divided through our choices that divide through selfishness, materialism, nationalism, all the racism, all the isms that divide one person from another, is how we restrict ourselves and limit ourselves. And what he referred to as his Father, and he also referred to as our Father, may be that perfect state of union and peace and absence of enforcement. After all, we are aware of something that I would argue is a primary cause, and that is our freedom of choice. Because if we have free choice, and we all, whether we sort of technically believe in it or not, we all act as though we do. We assume that we do, and that's why we hold ourselves and others responsible or bestow credit or blame for actions, because people could have done otherwise. They only could have done otherwise if they had freedom of choice. Free choice, by definition, is something that has no cause to happen other than itself. It's a primary causation. Okay? Now, what we call force in physical terms is secondary causation. It's like you choose to knock over one domino and then all the other dominoes fall over. The dominoes are hitting each other through force, and force is making change happen, but none of it had to happen if you hadn't decided to push the first one down. So what if matter has become, there's frozen light that has become frozen out of that restriction that we have taken on in becoming separate? And Jesus of Nazareth was actually showing us in what he taught and by how he lived the way that we could undo that restriction through caring and compassion, through recognition that our neighbour is ourselves, and that perhaps if we were able to do that completely, then, as he said, nothing will be impossible unto you. Now, it's interesting that if you look at the image on the shroud, that you can see that I would argue, sort of based upon the evidence that Dr. Lavoie has presented, that you're seeing the image there of an upright man, that the hair is down on the shoulders, the back of the body is not flattened, and even if there were rigor mortis, then it would still have been flattened, because rigor mortis, it only affects muscle, it doesn't affect skin and subcutaneous tissue. So you would expect flattening even if there were rigor mortis, and you would expect the hair to be behind the body. But no, it looks as though he was upright and somehow suspended above the ground, and at the time that the image formed, which appears to have been a short, intense burst of radiant energy. Now, these are two things that have become, I would argue, become apparent through the evidence looking at the Shroud using modern technology that people in medieval times, or 100, 200 years ago, wouldn't have known about. But they do, it's interesting that they coincide with anecdotal reports about this individual, Jesus of Nazareth, who is said at times to have walked on the water and to have risen above the ground. So in some sense, the enforcedness, inertia of his body had been reduced. And also he was seen at one point to shine brighter than the sun when he was on the mountain with Peter, James and John. And also we seem to have evidence of that on the Shroud. Now, the most fascinating thing for me about this walking on water thing is that not only did Jesus walk on the water, but also Peter is said to have walked on the water. And even more interesting is that at one point, when he had a moment of doubt, he sank into the water. Now, what is that telling us? It's telling us that our mind, our freedom of will, our attitude of mind is like a lens or a filter that allows through or disallows this light, light, or light of God, or whatever we want to call it. I use the word God advisedly because I don't want to be attached to any institutional or religious definition, but perhaps the light of what Jesus referred to as his Father, that is actually everywhere and is eternal and unites everything, and is where everything originally came from. And what we have done in making a physical universe and making ourselves as individuals is not to make light, but to limit it. We've made shadows and restriction. We've made ignorance, and we call that our ego, if you like. So, what if the life that this man had led was able to undo the force of his atoms and allow this light to shine through, whether it be from the space between atoms, or actually the atoms themselves, which are frozen light, actually becoming undone, just to a slight extent. It only needs to be a slight extent. As many people have done the calculations will know, if you release all the energy from a 70-kilogram man, you'd have a huge explosion that would be way bigger than any of the nuclear explosions that we've ever seen. But all it would take is just that slight difference, which might correspond to the amount of difference needed between the time of his death and perhaps if he was resurrecting at that moment, to undo the force sufficiently to allow life to prevail, physical life to prevail in that sense, in a different way, in a way that was perhaps moving in the opposite direction. In this physical universe, everything follows the second law of thermodynamics, and Jesus actually referred, I would argue, to the second law of thermodynamics when he spoke about moths and rust and thieves, that anything in this world will break down. He knew about that. But he also pointed out that there might be another way of existing, where there are no moths and no rust and no thieves, and where eternity is yours. And he said that to achieve that, he said that the most important thing he could tell anyone was loving your neighbour as yourself. It's perfect mathematical reason that if we have become restricted through division and we've become less than we were by limiting ourselves to ourself and ego, then if we were able to recognize the limitless eternal value of all humanity and live and act out of that recognition, then perhaps we might be getting closer to the original state that he referred to as our Father, as the source of all being. And then, as he said, anything would be possible. So, and this is all about bringing together the points of focus and awareness. And I would just like to leave you with one, what I feel is an important quote, and it follows after when he spoke about the moths and the rust and the thieves in the Gospel. And that quote is, "The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light." Thank you.